Lessons in Excellence, presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.
If it's general to be a specialist, it's also special to be a generalist. If this confuses you, well, you haven't yet seen what the rule of 3 has in store. Welcome to the world of generalists and specialists.
This is the rule of 3. As markets mature, they are dominated by 3 large players who straddle the volume space. The largest player usually has 40% of the market, while 10% is held by the third player. These large players are called full-line generalists. At the other end of the market are the product or market specialists. In the middle are the nowhere people, the ditch dwellers. To survive, these ditch dwellers must either shrink to become specialists or scale up and merge with generalists. Either way, the market reaches an equilibrium. 3 large volume players at one end, ringed by a constellation of small but highly profitable specialist companies. But each one has its own strategy for survival.
Jag, well, up until now we've seen the market realities that confront the various players we've spoken about.
Right.
Now we've touched upon strategies,
Right.
but let's spend a little bit of time on strategies required to confront these market realities.
Correct.
So why don't you go with what the big 3 should be doing? Is it a uniform, one size fits all strategy for all the 3?
No, surprisingly we found that even though they are all rule of 3 big players and basically volume driven, each one has a very different strategy.
That's interesting. Each one.
Each one has a very different strategy. Among many strategies, we narrowed down to 2 for each one of the players. One would be a defensive strategy, one would be an offensive.
That's for both. Both can have an offensive and a defensive
Correct.
strategy.
And
or should have an offensive.
Should have both offensive and defensive,
Okay.
each one of them. But they are very different for number 1 player versus number 2 versus number 3.
So let's look at the 40%.
Exactly. The best defensive strategy is be a fast follower, not a pioneer. By the way, the master at this game was IBM at one time, and today there is no company better than that than Microsoft.
Is that right?
Absolutely.
They pick up from smaller players.
Yes.
and roll the strategy. So they don't. Are you saying Microsoft doesn't innovate as much?
It has laboratories. Probably they are the best in the world in voice recognition technology. They know, just like IBM had great labs, Bell Labs, great labs. IBM, Bell Labs are great, but they don't innovate out of that one. They wait till market signals come about. Brilliant approach. Today, once you have somebody started a set-top business, Microsoft wants to come in there. Somebody wants to be in the internet, like Netscape came about, Microsoft immediately followed with their own browser, essentially, by and large. It is that kind of a quick scrambling with your market power and your resources. While the number 3 company innovates, you take it away.
Wonderful. So you use the capital side of your balance sheet and not so much your brain power.
Exactly. And
That's
I think
wonderful.
if you remember the old saying about Apple that used to, about IBM rather, that they would never take the first bite out of the apple in a new market. They would always, they would take the second bite.
That's interesting.
Once somebody else has found out, is it a rotten apple, is it a good apple? If it's a good apple, then IBM swallows up the rest of it.
Okay.
Right.
So this is the offensive or the defensive strategy for the 40%?
This is sort of the defensive.
This is the
according to-
defensive.
yes,
This is the
this
defensive. What's the
yes.
offensive?
The offensive strategy really is to say we need to grow, especially once you reach 40%, we grow by growing the total pie, not by trying to get a bigger piece of the existing pie. And that is especially true in India, because many of the markets that we're talking about even today have really only penetrated maybe 10 to 20% of their ultimate penetration potential. So if you look at cellular, we're at about 12 million today. Easily we're expecting 100 million by 2008.
Right. You're saying what Reliance and the others are doing of market expansion is then the correct...
That is exactly the correct strategy, and that has the potential for really reordering the landscape in terms of who becomes the leader, because 88% of that market over the next 5 years remains to be created.
Right. Okay.
So
What about the number 2, Jack?
Let's just continue on the number 1 as yet. In fact, surprisingly, you saw it happened. This is the brilliant strategy by not number 1. It should be by number 1. In the cellular business, again in India, BSNL out of nowhere became number 2 in 7 months, will surpass and become number 1 very quickly. Why? Because they had the reach into markets where everybody else was not playing. Growing the total market was the best strategy, and that's what happened again. So we think that number 1 company strategy should be, once the market has become mature, is to search for newer markets where the penetration or the usage, most of them are non-consumers. How do you make them into consumers?
In this instance, let's look a bit at Reliance's strategy. It's not the number 1, not the number 2, not the number 3. It's actually just become number 4.
Correct.
But it's gone for a huge market expansion strategy.
Correct.
Where does that fit in?
It actually, in some sense, it is trying to become number 1 by saying that playing in the same playpen like everybody else is going to not a good idea. Why not go into a new market altogether by offering a WLL architecture, a low-cost position? Because as my colleague just mentioned, the nascent market, the market that is there, nobody's tapping, is enormous. We find the same thing about the rural market in India. For example, all of the FMCG companies eventually figured out that their bigger market is surprisingly in rural size-wise. And they've rolled out, shampoos and soaps into smaller sizes, etc., etc. And this, again, I found very fascinating. Beer consumption in India is not in the top tier 1 markets, but it is in the top 2, tier 2 or tier 3 markets.
Well, let's talk about Maruti in that instance, the 800.
Precisely.
They've taken the 800 into a market expansion mode.
Absolutely.
But if you look at Tata's plans, now Ratan Tata has talked about a $2,000 car or 1 lakh rupee car, which will explode the market if it comes about.
If it ever comes about. So that's interesting. You're saying the 40%er don't innovate, don't spend so much energies on innovating as in taking someone else's innovation and capturing market with
money
that.
Better spent that way.
It's money.
It's not R&D, it's DNR. For the number 1 company, it's development first, research second.
Oh, that's interesting. DNR, don't do R&D. Don't do it. And the second, of course, you're saying expand the market because you are the biggest gainer of that.
And if you're not doing it like in the case of cars,
yes,
if Maruti is not aggressively pushing the $2,000 car vision, then Tata can use that as a way to become number 1.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. The rule of 3 says that mature competitive markets come to be dominated by 3 full-line generalists. So, you would think that these 3 big players are similar, but here's a surprise. Each of them must follow a different strategy, part defensive, part offensive. For the market leader, the defensive strategy is to be a fast follower rather than be a pioneer. And here's a closer look at what the second player should do to survive in this rule of 3.
Let's talk about the number 2 now. What's his offensive-defensive mix?
The number 2, if it is a distant number 2, like the dominant player is outrunning and number 2 has just begun the journey.
So it's about 20% market share?
Yeah, it's less than 20%.
Less than 20%.
Less than 20%. Let's say you are 10-15% market share trying to catch up. Then in the beginning stage of your life, you should coexist with number 1. Just clone and imitate number 1. Wherever they are going, you go after them very quickly, which is what Burger King did wonderfully well with McDonald's. Pepsi Pepsi in the early days did exactly that with Coca-Cola. You know, go after markets where there was more opportunity. Capital deployment will not take place, but once you become significant, start challenging. Interestingly, now Pepsi challenges Coke. Burger King began to challenge McDonald's, for example, and that's the kind of a strategy one needs to evolve.
And in India, have you seen any company doing this?
In India, we think that the coexistence market has been more common than challenging market as yet, but now players are getting to a size where they can compete. For example, banking. In banking now we see more and more the challenging attitude coming in to say, if there is a big bank out there, I mean State Bank of India is one of the largest out there, therefore everybody wants to like to see if they can challenge State Bank of India, ICICI Bank for example. I think we see that happening more now than ever before.
We also have seen it in aviation.
Yes.
We've seen Jet Airways coming in,
Very good.
literally following Indian Airlines, literally following it, and then
now.
once it reached a critical size,
Thank
here's
you.
Sahara. Sahara seems to be doing
Yes,
exactly the
the
same
thing.
thing.
No, you're right. Jet Airways is a classic case. I forgot about the whole thing, but Jet Airways is perfect case.
In fact, you were telling me about that while we were talking.
Right.
And even further, I mean, Jet Airways, now that they are virtually in a leadership position over Indian Airlines, they are now following the market growth strategy as well. They're growing the market through their Apex fairs and other marketing innovations, where they are actually, I was told by my friend that they actually called him at home and offered him an extremely low fare to go to Bombay for the weekend and come back, cheaper than the train fare.
So there you are.
Right?
So
So they are now growing that.
at under
growing that pie.
20%, follow the leader. When you start becoming close to the leader, jump ahead and take the leadership position.
Once you have that, then grow the pie.
Now, what's the offensive strategy for the number 2?
The offensive
three.
strategy is the challenge.
The
as
number
we just
2.
talked about.
We're still talking number 2, yes.
Yes, it is
Oh,
still
it's
the
the-
challenge, and the
okay.
defensive was the coexistence.
So it's more sort of
in
sequential
essence.
for this fellow. He doesn't
Yeah.
take both the challenges together.
No.
He
That's right.
sequences his strategies.
That's right. You have to be careful if you're a smaller player. You
Don't
cannot
get
directly.
offensive.
You don't get offensive unless your resources are overwhelmingly stronger.
Right.
And they're not in
Okay.
this case.
So for the second guy, it's be in sequence. First, clone, follow, learn the rules of the game, get market share, then attack. Number 3, Jack. What does the number 3 do?
Number-
Number
yeah.
3 is typically what? 12% market share, 13%?
Minimum is 10.
Yes, minimum.
Usually hovers around 10, 11, 11, 12, roughly around that time, where it plateaus.
Right.
It has, the defensive strategy is to make sure that the 12, 11% market share has a segment where they dominate almost 50-60% of the market, you know, one segment, so one niche segment. For example, if you are again a telephone company, you may have a government in your back, or in India, for example, you may be a luggage company like a Safari or a VIP,
Okay.
but you have a canteen corporation contract which may be taking your 30-40% capacity, which is serving the government military market essentially by and large, which is relatively stable market for you kind of a notion, you know. So
Like
you-
Jeep manufacturers, for instance,
like
who've
Jeep-
got, say, contracts, say Mahindra, the others who've got contracts with the government.
Exactly.
So you're dominating one small segment of the market, but you dominate it.
Correct, and that's the OEM supply. In automotive, it's very clear in India. Same thing in appliances industry. The people who supply parts to appliance industry in India, again, it's the same thing. You dominate one or two segments,
Right.
which may be car makers essentially or appliance makers. But then you begin that's your defensive strategy. My colleague calls it as a pseudo specialist, actually, right?
Yeah, pseudo specialist. That's right.
That's
Yeah.
what it is. So.
They're virtually people who dominate that vertical,
Yes.
but
and
yet
it is
they
a
are
large volume-oriented vertical, which is what makes
Right.
it different from a normal specialist.
Now, how do they attack? That's the defensive.
Now, the attack really is innovation. You know, the primary route to long-term survival and growth for number 3 companies, if it is to happen, there's no guarantee, is really to innovate, to come up, to break the boundaries, break the barriers, and come up with radically new things. I think earlier we mentioned Chrysler, which actually created automatic transmission. They created cab-forward design. They brought back the convertible in the US market. They invented the minivan.
Right.
And they've got a whole list of engineering and marketing innovations. They were the first one, for example, to introduce this notion of manufacturer's rebate,
Okay.
where you pay a certain price and then some of that comes back to you.
So innovate and try and gain market share. Coming back to Mahindra,
Right.
since they dominate quite a bit of the Jeep market, now comes the Scorpio.
Right.
And they are trying therefore to get into a more mainstream market.
Yeah. In the Indian automotive industry, we think that number 3 position was really by Tata. You know, you had the Maruti, obviously, ambassador. You know, those were the 2 big guys.
Right.
I think Tata played the same game. Be an innovator, come
Right.
out with new models in different places, maybe expand the total scope of the buying power. You know,
But
the
this
process.
this innovation of the Tatas that you're talking about isn't really a technological innovation, not even a market innovation, as much as a price point innovation.
Correct. It could be innovation into price points. In fact, the best story about price point innovation or innovation in general across everything is a company called Sprint in long distance business in America.
Right.
Once the rule of three came in place after deregulation, AT&T still survived. MCI became number two. Sprint always was innovative. They were the first ones to deploy fiber optic network when everybody else had a copper wire network for long distance calls. They are the first ones to come out with a pricing simplification. They came out with the idea 10 cents per minute. Don't calculate all these rates, you know, evening rates, weekend rates. It's too confusing to the public. Transparent. They were the first ones to use a typical show business personality as a spokesperson.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. 3 winners in every mature competitive market, but 3 different strategies for each of the winners. The biggest player should be a fast follower, but here's a warning for the leader: it should not attempt to be a pioneer. On the other hand, it should target to expand the market. The aspiring second player should have a neat strategy to win market share, a strategy that's defensive in the beginning for an all-out assault later. In India, the sequential strategy of quietly defend first and attack later has been successfully used by Jet Airways, which played in Indian Airlines' shadow until it reached a critical size. After that, Jet Airways took off the gloves and launched aggressive marketing initiatives to power ahead of the leader. While a clone and grow strategy works for the number 2, what's the deal for number 3?
The number 3, it's innovate or die. Die means come into becoming a specialist, if you're a pseudo specialist. Let's just continue with the big 3 for a while. Let me look at one statement that you make in your book. You say market share concentration depends on the extent to which fixed costs dominate the structure. Just give us very quickly what you mean. What I understand is that if my market share is really related to the extent to which fixed costs dominate my cost structure.
Right.
Where's the relationship?
The relationship is that industries vary in their structure, whether they are going to be capital intensive versus non-capital intensive. Aerospace is the most capital intensive industry I have found.
Right.
Automotive is the second most, for example. You have to have minimum amount of millions or billions of dollars to just start a factory essentially. Surprisingly, the most capital intensive industry is semiconductors today. Semiconductors. To make a wafer factory, initial cost is $2.4 billion. Do you know that any company other than Intel cannot think of starting on their own, with their own capital, a new wafer factory, whether you are a Motorola or whether you are a Samsung, that makes no difference. They cannot do it on their own.
So
too risky.
That's interesting. You're saying the per unit cost of that product is dirt cheap, but the capital required for it is huge.
And that's exactly where you get the economies of scale, or what the economist would call it, the experience curve. Think about the following. Software is more and more a fixed cost industry. To make a Windows NT in those days, today Windows XP, it will cost you $250 million to $500 million easily to create an operating system. The first copy is that expensive. The cost of a second copy is nothing.
Right.
Just a duplication cost.
Right.
So 2 ingredients of electronics age, chips and software, are becoming more and more fixed cost industries.
Interesting. You would, as you said, you would think aeroplanes and cars, just by looking at them, you say, well, Yes, this has got to be capital intensive. But to think that the chip inside this phone is actually one of the most capital intensive industries.
Yeah.
And you're saying now that links in with the extent of market share, i.e., if Intel has 70% of the market, one of the reasons is that Intel is one of the most capital intensive industries.
And that's exactly what Microsoft is all about.
Oh.
For the same reason.
That's interesting.
That becomes a wall to protect that market share. It says that that's why Intel and Microsoft can keep those high market shares. Others cannot come in and make the scope and the scale of investment.
So how do you attack
needed.
them? In consortiums?
Yes.
Is that the only way?
Yes.
That you come in and attack them through that?
That's primarily one of the ways, yes.
And is that something you're seeing in either in the software business or in chips?
Clearly. Give you an example. When IBM dominated the mainframe computing business on the software side with their own assembler language, machine language, there was a consortium by what is known the Seven Dwarfs, IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. They all got together with Bell Labs and created a second operating system called Unix. Same thing is happening now in the PC software. Microsoft dominance now is being challenged by Linux that began, but it's being supported by IBM, and I was absolutely surprised. Oracle just announced they will also support a Linux architecture.
Right.
Because they don't want to have the monopoly power of Microsoft sustained for too long.
And let me feed on borrowed wisdom from you from earlier recordings. Airbus was a consortium.
Exactly. Airbus was a consortium.
So there you are.
Oh, you have read the book.
That's said borrowed wisdom.
A bit of a counter example to that. I mean, if you look at Intel's dominance and how they were able to sustain in the microprocessor segment 85–90%, the only company really that was in a position to challenge was Motorola. Motorola has the scale, the technology, the scope, etc. to be able to do that. But they made a very strategic mistake, which was to align too closely with Apple. Motorola became the sole supplier for Apple's computers, and they chose to neglect the 85–90% of the market that was based on the Windows platform. The basic idea is that you need economies of scale. The whole name of the game on the right side of that curve, or the volume side, is economies of scale. Not just in manufacturing, but also in procurement and also in marketing and branding.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.